So carrying a message from those books, I just want to say, as I've read them before coming out and especially during coming out, I feel like those books are for us. That message really is for us. And the longer I'm out and the longer I'm doing things that are sort of para-church things and para-academic things, because that's the liminal space where we're allowed, is a very powerful place of God's presence, a very powerful experience of God's presence. So I wanted to say that Exodus, Exodus of course means coming out. So I think it's one of the meanings of that word, the road out. It's a coming out story in a lot of ways. And like it is maybe for some of us after GC 2019, for someone like myself even before that, coming out can be an experience of not necessarily basking in the glow of God's promises immediately, even though they've been made, as they were to Aaron and Moses. They received promises about a land of milk and honey. It's more than just your basic needs. It's the stuff that's sweet and fatty. It's more than you need. It's good. But the people weren't convinced by that. It really wasn't until Pharaoh's army is chasing them out. That's when they finally go towards the promises, because it's that or die. And I can't speak for anybody else's experience of coming out, but that was my experience of coming out. I wasn't going to come out of that closet until the door was more, I had no other choice. And I know for a lot of folks who are trans, as I've heard, when I helped launch Trans Lifeline, we got to hear tens of thousands of trans people's stories from around the country who reached out to us, those of us that started Trans Lifeline. This is a very common story, that it's like, we're not necessarily busting down our own closet door. It's when there's no choice but to die, then we go forward, because we know it's going to be wilderness time. And I'm not carrying this message to you today to make it about me, but in a lot of ways I see my friends who have been still in the UMC, who have still been in mainstream churches right in this moment. It's a time of being forced out into the wilderness, maybe at a moment when you weren't expecting for it, weren't looking for it. But there it is. Now you're there. So I'm sharing some of that message and that lived experience as well. That the false security, in a sense, of Egypt, it was familiar. They longed for it when they were out in the wilderness after being pushed out, chased by Pharaoh's armies, chariots and weapons, ostensibly. The book says the wilderness shut them in and hid them. So God protects them in this wilderness experience. And God orders them, it's actually a very straight path to where they were headed, but God orders them to take a very long, roundabout way. And so they're spending more time than they needed to, fearful, lost, wandering, in exile. They don't just, book it to the promised land. And they spend a lot of this time complaining, as we all know. If you're familiar with the story, they're spending a lot of time, it was better in Egypt, like the passage we just heard. Are there no graves left in Egypt? We could have died there. Why are we here? So again, this is a story I think that's very powerful for those of us who maybe experience some losses when we come out, especially as people of faith, to communities of faith that may or may not be welcoming to us. There are some losses that a lot of us experience. For me, coming out, it was, as you mentioned, I was let go after being in a full-time, full professor position in theology for 15 years. And let go not just by my employer, but by my family, by my community of faith in some ways, the wider community. There was a sense, a lot of the first few years, where I was saying, what the heck did I do? Did I just, what have I done to myself? Why? The message of Exodus, of course, is that as they're longing for the comforts, the familiarity of Egypt, even though they were enslaved there, they are staying alive. Now, what are they staying alive on? We've heard the story of manna, and I know we're biblical scholars here, so you already know this. Indulge me if you do, and forgive me for bringing up something you already know, but more or less scholars say that probably what that manna was the secretions of bug lice. Bugs are lice, excuse me, plant lice. Sorry. So there are secretions of plant lice, oral secretions that dry in the sun into flakes that are kind of sweet, and they are perishable. You can't store them up, just like the story says. You get what you need today, you can live on it. It's certainly not milk and honey. And for me, and for I think for some of us, maybe going into this season now, it can be coming out can be this Lenten experience of maybe I'm getting exactly what I need to sustain me, but I'm sure living precariously, it's scary. I don't like it. I'm sad. I'm lost. I'm lonely. These are all feelings that we see. I feel like God honors these feelings by putting them in the scripture and making them central to who the people of God are. It's okay to have those feelings. That's really a normal reaction to being lost and in the wilderness and living precariously. Even so, God continues to make these promises. It's not always going to be like this. Yes, it's like this now, but it's not always going to be like this. One of the things that strikes me in these stories is the time when the people really struggle the most is when even their leader from within their own community, Moses, goes away for a while. Now Moses is having a wonderful 6-week experience of deepening intimacy with God, talking face to face. The word that's used is friends with God. They're having friendly chat together for 6 glorious weeks on the mountain. It's just wonderful. But the people can't see this. They have to just trust this. They feel more lost, and because they can't see Moses, they can't see God, they're not getting direction. In those 6 weeks, they come up with this idea of, you know what, let's just take all our jewelry, melt it together, we'll make something we can see. Well, they sing, they dance, they eat, so the golden calf story. But you know, one of the things that's really striking about this golden calf is it's something that they do as a community. It does bond them together. It does have that effect. They use the things that they have. They contribute their own stuff to it, make it themselves, and they feel like it belongs to them. Somehow it's a very centering experience for them. Of course, when Moses comes down, he's like, what did you just do? Yeah. The word that's used frequently in this part of the story is stiff-necked. You stiff-necked people. What did you do? And one of the things that strikes me about this word is when I first came out, when I was in the process of coming out, there was a lot of media, there was a lot of death threats, there were police escorting me from the parking lot to my office and back to the parking lot, and from my office to the classroom because of the death threats that were coming. And I developed, this is when I got to understand stiff-necked. Again, I'm not trying to make this about me, but I got to experience in my body that I held all that tension in my neck, my jaw, my shoulders, my upper back, because I was going to still teach those students of mine who I loved so much and didn't want to be torn away from 3 to 5 weeks into the semester. I wanted to finish the semester. I had a lot of feelings about it, but I held them all here. And I got to a point when I would get in that car, finally escorted there by the armed police officer, I had to move this way. I had to move my whole body, in other words, to see peripherally. I got to the point where I could not move my neck. Again, not trying to make this about me, I'm just saying I remembered very vividly as I was experiencing that, oh, that's what that phrase stiff-necked means. They're stressed out. They're stressed out. Moses is who knows where, they're not getting any direction, and they're stressed out. So they make something they can see, that they can all do together. It's not really, we hear a lot of stories about making false idols. I have a lot of compassion for why they did that. I think we've done things like that. I think when I was a student in Claremont, we did some things like that sometimes. And it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It maybe just wasn't the optimal thing. It was a thing we did at the time to get through it. And it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. And in fact, Moses and God have an argument about all this. And God decides, you know what, I'm not going to punish these folks. I'm going to ask them not to be stiff-necked. I'm going to tell them they were stiff-necked. But I'm not going to punish them. That's it. That's all there is to it. In fact, this passage actually shows us how to pray in these times when we're feeling stiff-necked. The way Moses prays when he sees all this is he argues with God. And again, it's one of those passages, much like Job, that tells us part of our prayer life, it's totally okay. It's canonical to yell at God. Okay, so here we are, post-GC 2019. It's okay to be mad. It's even okay to be mad at God. What the heck with those stiff-necked people that threw us out of the church, right? So being afraid, expressing your fear, expressing your anger, expressing your confusion, it's totally okay. It's centered in this story. It's woven throughout this whole story. And in fact, it seems that being able to talk about those things in our prayer life with each other and with God helps us not to fall into the temptation of building a golden calf again. So opening up about that pain is a way to stay real with God, to stay present to God and let God stay present to us, to be more aware of God's presence so that we don't have to build something that we can make ourselves and see and touch. These stories remind us that God is with us and for us, even when what sustains us seems to be so very little. As God told Moses in the wilderness in the passage that was just read, sometimes at some point it's time to stop crying and start moving forward. Even though we don't know where we're going, and we're just trusting that God's with us in it. One of the last things I wanted to mention about this story, it was very striking to me when I read it again while I was coming out, is that of those 40 years in the desert, 35 of them are spent in one spot. Mm-hmm. They're not actually walking through the desert for 40 years, which is what I always thought it was for some reason. No, they plant themselves at a little oasis. They have just what they need to live and no more. And that's good enough. They're afraid to move forward. They build the tabernacle, God's direction. There's something they can see, and they know it's part of God is present with them, so they don't have to build a golden calf again. They have the tabernacle, and that's good enough. There's milk and honey being promised to them. They're going to stick with the bug spit because they got the bug spit here and now. It's not some pie in the sky and the sweet by and by. So these stories really, I feel like, remind us that God sustains us even at times like these when we're lost and stuck and afraid, and when waiting seems so demoralizing, and freedom is such a long, long time coming. But waiting, even God reminds them here, especially when he's talking, when God, not he, sorry, I don't think God is a he, actually use she for God. But anyway, God is reminding Moses that waiting can be a spiritual gift. The long grind of feeling lost helps counter our tendency to take credit for the fullness of our own lives when things are going well. One of the long passages here in Deuteronomy 8 and 9 is God ranting about this is what's going to happen when you have everything you want. You're going to think you did it. You're going to get distracted, and you're going to be just like those people that you ran away from. So watch out for that. This period of just getting by is a period when you feel my presence with you. And it's meant to help sustain you when those better times come. From these experiences of surviving on the material, relational, or spiritual equivalent of dried up bug spit, manna, day after day, we do have an opportunity to learn humility and resilience that are deeper than that of those who are secure in their own righteousness and feel so quick to exclude us. As God tells Moses, this is so that in the end it might go well for you. Decades of feeling lost and insecure, surviving only on minimal sustenance day to day, help us know deeply that we need God, a power greater than ourselves, to sustain us spiritually, emotionally, and physically, to teach us that people do not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. The fullness of life that God promises isn't primarily the material here. The milk and honey thing, I know the promised land is extremely problematic. It does seem, looking at the text, that one interpretation is that what is promised is the fullness of love. Because over and over and over again, God says, not about primarily material promises, but the promise is that we can find fulfilled, even in our waiting, an ability to love God with our whole heart and soul. The Shema comes from these passages, from Deuteronomy. The promise is that we can love fully and truly. God encourages us in this seemingly impossible to endure waiting, in this seemingly impossible perfect love with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, to say that it's not too difficult for you. That's what God says here. It's not too difficult for you or beyond your word. You're beyond your reach. The word is very near you. It's in your mouth and it's in your heart, so you can obey it. I'm with you that intimately. This life of trustful waiting for fulfillment of God's promises requires us not to give up, not to settle for the lesser and very mixed comforts of life in oppressive bondage, going backwards, or the minimal security that we can see but that doesn't really help life flourish, whatever that is for us, whatever our golden calf is, whatever our Kadesh oasis is. We had to be chased out of Egypt, some of us, and we may mourn and long for these familiar comforts, including people we thought were our friends. But we were slaves in Egypt. Some who call themselves Christian may well cast our pride in Lenten terms. They preach a crucified Jesus, who stumbles on the way of sorrows, and one even less for us, whose marriages and ministries are in their minds beyond redemption. We're to suffer, atone, each on our own Via Dolorosa, alone. But we are an Easter people. We are a resurrection people. Yes, pride, even during Lent. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves again be burdened by a yoke of slavery.